Thank you so much. First of all, I welcome all of you to the fresh round of the CCT events. As I see a lot of new faces today, and so I think I should just quickly introduce to you the program of CCT. CCT is the kind of discursive program of our school where we invite people from different kinds of disciplines, different kinds of cultural backgrounds, architects, planners, urban designers, artists, environmentalists, all sorts of creative, interesting people who are interested in the discussion of ideas related to urbanity, architecture and design, and also culture. We've ran this program successfully for the last 3 years since we started. This is the 4th year. So CCT events happen every fortnight. We try to kind of continue this series by calling speakers every 15 days, and many of you have been consistently attending, which I really appreciate. Also, under the CCT, we have been holding a lot of different kinds of subsections or programs. First is the C Conversations, wherein we bring in diverse voices. The second is C Emerging Practices, where we try to call in practices which are fresh, new young practitioners which need a platform to showcase and discuss their work. And then we have recently also we've been organizing C Exhibitions, which is one of the first of its kind started by any architecture school in the city and even the country. And this, just the last year, we also had our first C Pavilion series, where we invited a young architecture practice to have a full-fledged kind of pavilion in the premises of the school, which many of you may have seen the dismantled parts of while just walking upstairs. So yeah, that's the kind of background to the CCT events. Today we have a very interesting speaker and very who's speaking on a subject which is very dear to all of us, and that's why a lot of people have been wanting to talk to her, wanting to meet her, and also kind of attend this talk. We have Abigail McGowan, who is an associate professor at the University of Vermont, and she's also the associate dean at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Vermont. Her work focuses on research on South Asian visual culture and material culture. She's written a lot of books. Her first book, Crafting the Nation in Colonial India, explores the politics of crafts and craft development in colonial Western India. She's also the co-editor of a volume of essays on consumption in colonial India, titled Towards the History of Consumption in South Asia, which is published by Oxford University Press in 2010. And then she's also the author of articles on Indian crafts, design, consumption, housing, and domestic furnishings, which have appeared in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, Modern Asian Studies, and a range of them. I had the opportunity of attending Abigail's talk last year at the University of Mumbai, where she spoke about the domesticity in Indian homes, specifically Mumbai in the colonial period in India. And so we invited her today to actually kind of talk about an offshoot from this interest of hers on housing and community housing in colonial India. I'll not kind of detail much and leave the remaining kind of elaboration for Abigail to do. So I invite Abigail on the stage, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here. I thank Neera Darkar for inviting me and Anuj for all of his hard work in making all the arrangements and making all of this possible. I want to start with a little bit of a caveat. First of all, I always get a little nervous talking in front of students of architecture because I'm not a scholar of architecture. I come to it through an interest in material culture, as Anuj said, but also in a deep interest in the intersection between spaces and the ways people use them. And so I come at it not from the formalist interest in how buildings are designed, but instead in their utilization. And that's sort of my focus here today. I also want to put what I'm doing today a little bit in the broader context of the current book that I'm writing. So I'm writing a book right now which is looking at changes in housing in Bombay between 1900 and 1960, looking at all the different kinds of projects that were active in that period by which people were trying to change both the buildings that were built in the city, but also how people use those buildings, what they put in those buildings, how they understood the ideal of a home and usually measured themselves as not reaching that ideal. And so this involves everything from the sort of slum clearance and urban development projects of the Bombay Improvement Trust to things like rewriting building bylaws and creating town planning rules in order to enable the expansion of the city. This involves things like the community housing projects that I'm talking about today. It involves also things like the history of shopping. I always laugh that I get some of the more frivolous sounding historical projects that I get interested in. But the ways in which new retail spaces and new firms in the city are creating and encouraging different kinds of demands is really central to the kinds of projects I'm interested in. And then finally, it's also a project that is interested in how the professionalization of architecture itself helps to encourage new styles of buildings in the city, and particularly new styles of residential space. With then a close of thinking about the ways that domestic science, home economics are themselves helping to educate new generations of girls into the principles of homemaking. So trying to fit all those together to see how the idea of home is being reinvented. Doesn't mean everyday practice always changed in the same ways, but thinking about those ideas. So this project comes out of there, and I should say, I was lamenting to Neera right before the talk, it's a project that literally I'm right in the middle of, so I would very much love your questions, I would love your feedback afterwards, and I'll try to leave plenty of time for all of that. Okay, so if people are interested in the history of Bombay, out of that long list of projects I just talked about, the one that's probably most familiar to people is the Bombay Improvement Trust, which again, clears slums, builds chawls, launches the sort of development of the suburbs in Bombay. And I'm interested in that project, and it's an important one to be sure. But what the Bombay Improvement Trust does is it provides the framework for construction. It has a chawl construction program of its own, and it builds housing for workers. But most of the construction in the city is not done by the trust, but merely on trust lands or enabled by new trust roads that open up new sections of the city. So what I'm interested in is what those buildings were, how they came about, and what they meant to the people who lived in them. To be honest, most of the story is not what I'm talking about today, which is these community housing projects. Most of it is the story, obviously, of private construction, private buildings. But those are stories that are almost impossible to tell in a coherent way through the archives we have. We can get approval of plans from the Bombay Municipal Corporation archives, if they ever let you in them. You might be able to get the history of an individual building here or there, but those stories are very hard to trace. What is easier to trace, and so one of the reasons why I got interested in community housing, is the ways in which different groups in the city launched efforts to solve the housing crisis on their own. And so these were efforts that captured a more public face. They're public in the sense that at the time they were covered in the newspaper. They're public in the sense that the communities themselves wrote about them, talked about them, reflected back on them. And they're public in the sense that they offer this way in which communities intersect with the development of the city overall. So that's how I came to these as a project, and that's where I'm sort of going with, I'm losing things as I go. What I want to do in the sort of time I have, and again, I promise I'll try to keep it relatively short to leave time for questions, is first I want to give an overview for the two examples that I'm focusing on. One, the sort of Parsi colonies, and then the second, the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Societies, and explain how they came about and where they expanded and what that trajectory looks like. Second, I want to think about why I'm calling them a joint project of community housing. Because on the one hand, the Parsi Bogs or the Gamdevi Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society, they don't look anything alike, and they weren't experienced as being similar at the time. So what are those commonalities and why do they matter? And then third, I want to close with thinking about the so what question. Why do these community housing projects matter, not just for the individual people who were lucky enough to get a flat in them, and they were very lucky, but for the city as a whole. How do they contribute to our understanding of the city? But first, let me start with a little bit of scene setting. If I can advance my slides. Hold on. Advice? Oh, it's showing up here and not there. There's always a technical problem somewhere. You bring a cultural historian into the room and the technology fails immediately. So bizarre. Okay, I'm just going to start talking. We'll figure it out as we go. Poor Anuj will have to figure it out for me. Okay, so the first, I want to start with sort of two scene-setting examples, and I'll explain why they're significant in a minute. The first came on April 1st, 1889, when a crowd of what the Times of India reported to be almost 3,000 people came to witness the foundation laying ceremony of two new buildings that were being built at Tardeo, on what became known as Gilder Lane. And these were foundations for buildings that were meant to house the Parsi poor. These buildings were the brainchild of somebody known as Khan Bahadur M.C. Murzban. He was the executive engineer with the Public Works Department with the Bombay government. Murzban is mostly known for his official work. He oversaw a lot of the construction of the big buildings on the Esplanade. He himself was a designer. He was not a formally trained architect, but he designed things like the Alexandra Native Girls School and the Kama Hospital for Women, etc. But the buildings that they were laying the foundations for in 1889 were very different. They weren't big public monuments. Here's the Times of India article I was talking about. They weren't, thank you, Anuj. So these were some of the buildings Murzban designed. The buildings on what became Gilder Lane were not big monuments. They were instead very small, very modest housing meant for the very poor. Specifically for, on the one hand, members of the working classes. So Murzban was interested in housing artisans, mechanics, the respectable poor, as he liked to call it. But then also for widows. And so again, there was houses reserved for the use of widows where they were living in one-room units, not with their own self-contained units, meant to support the people who had the most difficulty finding housing in the city. The second example also attracted the public attention of the Times. This was the opening ceremonies in December 1915 for 3 buildings at Gamdevi that were part of what was the first cooperative housing society in all of Asia, the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society. This was an event that drew the chairman of the Bombay Improvement Trust, the chief executive health officer in the Bombay presidency, the members of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, etc. Quite a big event. If Murzban was the sort of person behind the Parsi housing project, here the key person was S.S. Talmaki. He was an employee at the Bombay High Court and various official roles there, who was an incredibly passionate and incredibly active organizer on behalf of cooperatives. What became the Gamdevi Society, and I'll refer to it as the Gamdevi Society because it's a whole lot easier than saying the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society every time. The idea behind the society was that by pooling capital, by coming together as a group to stand security on a loan, by organizing construction as a joint project, people who had relatively modest incomes could afford to get access to a fancy new flat, or not even that fancy. These were relatively modestly scaled. But essentially, what Talmaki argued is that cooperatives, then the sort of structure of cooperatives, enabled access to housing to people who would not be able to get it in any other way. And in this case, Talmaki was specifically interested in the lower middle classes. Murzban was very much interested in the poor and the very poor in his community. Talmaki was interested in the lower middle classes, partly because people did need to put down some capital, which generally was the distinguishing feature. I start with these 2 articles from the Times, and I use those to introduce these 2 events, to think about the ways in which these 2 events marking the creation, the foundation, the opening of 2 buildings were themselves seen as public events, seen as events of significance to the city as a whole. If it had been merely a private building put up by an individual landowner, the Times of India would never have covered it. It would have been beneath their own notice, certainly unimportant. But the public attention helps speak to the way in which the Times and a lot of other people at that moment saw these as real innovations in the city. They're innovations for each community, mostly in the sense that each project, the Merzban Charles or the Gum Davy Society, offered a chance for the communities to have fixed locations in the city, to legally limit who is going to live in each society to the members of one community. It's not that, there weren't residential or community neighborhoods before, but those were usually done by social pressure or landlord ownership or the landlord choosing who they wanted to let in. Here, in the deeds of these buildings, in the trust conditions that set them up, they are restricted access. They are restricted to membership of that community. And I'll come back to what that means a little bit towards the end. The other part, though, is that they were innovations not just for those communities in terms of fixing them in place and restricting access, but for the city as a whole. Even as of 1889, certainly by 1915, Bombay considered it, you will be relieved to know, as already in a housing crisis. The crisis was early on mostly seen in terms of health. So particularly when the plague arrives in Bombay in 1896, there's a sense in which bad housing, overcrowded conditions, slum-like buildings, these are all things that made you die. The places where the plague spread, the places where the most deaths were the places with the worst housing conditions in the city. So a lot of the arguments in the early 1900s about why you should build new housing is so you won't die. It will save your life. You will be stronger and healthier because of it. But by the time of the Gum Davy Society, there was also this increasing desire for affordability. So the crisis was one of health, and the second was affordability. Again, this is the ongoing themes of Bombay, right? And so in that sense, by the time the Saraswat Society comes up, the concern is that the lower middle classes are unable to get the styles and the types of accommodation they want. They want, at more than the one-room tenements available in the chawls, they want more privacy. They want more space for respectable life, so you can separate sleeping quarters, so you can, again, preserve the sort of dignity of family life from the prying eyes of neighbors, all of these things. So there was a sense, and this is how they were understood at the time, that both of these options, one, the sort of Merzban Charles, and the second, the cooperative model, were solutions potentially to Bombay's housing crisis. And Talmaki says that absolutely explicitly in his speech at the opening of the Gum Davy Society. So at that ceremony, he gives a silver key to the J.P. Orr, who's the chairman of the Bombay Improvement Trust, and he says that he hopes it, quote, might prove in Mr. Orr's hand to be the key to the solution of the housing problem in Bombay. So again, I want you to think about cooperative housing as starting with very small groups of people, starting with very small communities, but offering from the beginning a model. Whether or not it was a successful model, we can talk about. Okay, so that's how they get started. I want to walk you through the parallel developments of the Parsi example first and then the Saraswat example, so you can get a sense of both the scale, but also what was meant in addition to just housing and buildings that provided residential accommodation. I'm going to start again with the Parsi example. And here, there's sort of three moments that I'll be talking about. The first is these Merzban shawls that come up between 1890s and about 1910, which are housing for the poor. The second example is the very famous Parsi bogs, the stories of the Khusro Bog, Rustam Bog, the sort of big gated communities that the N.N. Wadia family helps build across Bombay. And then the third example is the creation of the Dadar Parsi colony, which emerges in the 1920s. So I'll move through each one of those in turn, with the idea that each one is building on each other. So they come with different actors, different agents, different funding mechanisms, but they were understood generally as a Parsi housing problem and a Parsi housing solution. So again, a community-based effort. The most direct example of them building on each other comes from the Merzban example. So the first building, the foundation stone, is laid in 1889. The success of that building then immediately inspires others. And what Merzban does is he goes around to wealthy members of the Parsi communities and asks for donations. Once those donations reaches a certain amount, he builds a building. Once that building is full and he can raise enough donations, he builds another building. So again, one leads to another in that way. And again, throughout, they're attracting the attention for the press. This is partly because Merzban is really good with the media. He has these grand ceremonies inviting the governor of Bombay, sort of leading officials in the city to come and witness this, thereby sort of cementing the sort of publicity of the event in really tangible and really material ways. When he does it, again, the sense is that These are events that are marking the achievement of a particular building, but they're also meant to celebrate the Parsi community as a whole. So the title on the right, Housing Bombay's Poor, the example of the Parsis. The Times of India is routinely saying that the Parsis have it figured out. They are the model here for everyone to follow. And what was a point of particular pride for the Parsis in this case was the sense that their efforts had started in 1889, whereas the city woke up to the need for sanitary housing after the plague arose in 1896. So from the Parsi perspective, they got there first. Not surprisingly, given this kind of attention, the Burzbanchals inspire others. There's something called the Zoroastrian Building Association, the Parsi Panchayat. Different groups get involved on a sort of similar model, to build more housing. The real person, though, who takes things to a next level is a woman. Her name was Bai Jirbai Nauroji Wadia. She was the widow of Nauroji Nasaranji Wadia, and he was a textile magnate. A lot of his money had come from the creation of Bombay dyeing and manufacturing. So one of these big industrialists in the city. After her husband dies in 1899, Jirbai is left in charge of his estate entirely. He had left in his will a sort of vague statement that the money was supposed to be used, quote, for the welfare of the members of the Parsi community. But that was it. She had a fortune of 8 lakhs and she could do what she wanted with it. The first thing she did is invest it, and she was apparently a very good investor, so the money kept growing. But her first initial efforts were in sort of common Parsi philanthropy efforts, building hospitals, funding schools, etc. Very quickly, though, she turns to housing, and she turns to it in a big way. Her first project is what becomes Nowroz Bagh. It starts in 1908 when she buys a big plot of land in Parel, which was then mostly empty, and puts up a set of housing. I think originally 8 buildings, which eventually over time keep growing and growing. So that, let me get my numbers right. By the late 1970s, there were 358 flats spread across a total of 13 buildings. The success of Nowroz Bagh then inspires Jirbagh to keep going. She gets her sons involved, so her son Khusro is involved, her son Ness is involved, and they start launching more projects. These are what are known as, again, those sort of famous baghs, and they're named quite obviously after the members of the family. Nasra Bagh is named after her husband. Rustam Bagh, which was started in 1924, is named after her youngest son who had died in 1919. Jirbagh is named after Jirbai's death. It's named in honor of her. And then Khusro Bagh is named for the older son, and Ness Bagh, which comes in the 50s, is for the younger son. And these are all managed by, they're created by, they're funded by Wadia Trust, the NN and RN Wadia Trust buildings for Parsi Zoroastrians. And again, these were huge. These were huge projects in scale, in scope, in money, and in impact. By 2008, there's almost 1,500 flats across these 5 baghs. And the cost of them in the sort of monetary value at the time was valued at 1.25 crore rupees. So again, that's the value of rupees in 1908, 1932, etc. You can only imagine what the equivalent would be now. Of these various baghs, the biggest in extent, scale, impact, splash was Khusro Bagh. This is after Jirbaig's death. Sir Khusro and Sir Ness, the 2 brothers, buy a whole set of land on Colaba Causeway. It had been a former railway yard. And they start planning this massive project. And it's massive, as you can see from the scale of it, but it's also massive in terms of its sort of presence in the city. They hire the best architectural firm in the city, Gregson, Bately and King, to design this facade and some of the earlier buildings. In 1934, later in this year, it was those initial buildings were completed. Eventually, it comes to have a total of 546 flats, ranging in size from 2-bedroom all the way up to 4-bedroom flats. So these are, again, often quite big, which you keep in mind as we're thinking about these as meant for the poor in the community. But these were crucially, and Khusro Bagh is a great example, not purely residential spaces. So within Khusro Bagh, there were gardens and lawns, a playground, tennis and badminton courts, a school, a library, 2 dispensaries, a large hall for events, various sporting and welfare associations, and of course, an agyari, which opened in 1935. So again, the idea is not just you build housing, but you provide all the amenities for the residents, everything you would need, aside from food, and basic services are provided within the compound for you. That compound of services and that combination of services and housing was common across all of these bogs to different degrees. Kasur was sort of the high-end one, and Nusra Bog was probably the lower-end one, but they all had some version of these different amenities. It was also then common to the next iteration of Parsi housing developments, and this is the Dadar Parsi colony. The Dadar Parsi colony comes up in the 1920s. It's the brainchild of Mancherji Joshi, who, again, like Merzban, like Talmaki, was trying to solve the housing problem through a different means. He was very well connected. He was also an executive engineer, this time with the city, and he worked very closely with the Bombay Improvement Trust. So when the Bombay Improvement Trust was planning its new Dadar suburbs, he managed to secure over 200 plots, and this is the sort of map of the colony, in the new Matunga area that was coming up for development, to be reserved for Parsis. The development of the colony took a slightly more various, heterogeneous form than did the bogs or the Merzban ones, in that there were some buildings on the property, the one on the left, for instance, that were built by private landlords, usually on a rental basis. Somebody might live on the top floor and rent out the other floors, or just have the entire thing built as rental. This one was one of 3 buildings this landlord had built. Others were built as part of a cooperative housing society that Mancherji Joshi himself helps to found. So this was Joshi's house in the colony. And then there were also philanthropic trust-built houses for the poor included within the colony as well. As with the bogs, the community amenities followed quickly, and the list of them is particularly fabulous for the DPC. By 1924, there was a free school for Parsi children, a dispensary, and a madrasa to train Parsi priests. By 1926, they had added the marriage hall on the right. The Agiari came in 1929. By 1930, they had an orchestra. And by 1937, they had added the Dadar Parsi Gymkhana. And not surprisingly, this all proved enormously popular. So that by 1930, the total population of DPC was about 5,000. Estimates now are there's maybe 10,000 Parsis who live in the Dadar Parsi colony, making it the largest community concentration of Parsis anywhere in the world. Okay, so that's the Parsi example. Let me turn to the Saraswat example and lay that one out for you. Here the story, as I said before, starts with SS Talmaki, who was really the driving force, the inspiration, the sort of energy behind it all. Talmaki brought a couple of key traits to the project of launching community housing. One, quite frankly, is that he was already a community leader. When the Kanara Saraswat Association, the community association, is founded in 1911, he's its first president. He's involved in every major event of the Saraswat community, all the way up to the formation of the society. So when you're thinking about how do you possibly convince somebody, your fellow people, to put their money up for an untried venture in which they might definitely lose a lot of money, it helps to have some stature in the community to get you going in all of that. The second thing he brought to the project is that he was already deeply invested in cooperatives. From the minute cooperatives start in Bombay with the Cooperative Societies Act of 1904, he's there on the ground. In 1906, he helps to found a community cooperative bank, the Shamra Vital Cooperative Bank, or the SVCB. And again, it proves highly successful in helping people mobilize their capital for different ends, helping to raise the sort of finances of the community and make them more stable. More broadly, he was involved in every kind of cooperative effort across the Bombay presidency. So when there's a Bombay Cooperative Housing Association started in 1913, he's its honorary secretary. When the Bombay Provincial Cooperative Institute starts, he's its honorary secretary, and he serves there for 14 years. He helps to found and get going cooperatives in every possible field: agriculture, consumer stores, banking, housing, etc. So again, cooperative knowledge, experience he brings to the project. The third thing he brings is quite simply that he was very well connected. So he'd been working in the High Court for years. He knew people in every section of the city, so that when they go to start planning this society, he can get concessional rates and rents from the Bombay Improvement Trust. The architect of the Bombay Improvement Trust supplies drawings for the project. He can get a loan from the head of the SVCB because he helped to found it. Again, in all these ways, he's able to pull in his networks to help make this possible. All that said, the community itself was particularly well suited for an experiment in cooperative housing. The Kanara Saraswat community was very small in the city at that point. As of 1912, when they did a community census, there were only 260 households in the entire city. So small group here. So getting people together, convincing them to trust each other was not necessarily that hard. It was also a very homogeneous community in terms of education. There was virtually no adult illiteracy among men and about 30 illiterate women as adults. So again, enormously high literacy rates, enormously high education rates. Most of the members of the community were in white-collar jobs, working as clerks in government offices, with particular speciality in municipal government. So again, if you are trying to create a municipal project, knowing people in all the offices across the city is going to help you out here. This is a community which, because of the bank, had a strong history and a proven track record with cooperative organizing, and a strong sense that they were essentially fundamentally middle class. So it was a community who was willing to risk something to achieve what they thought was the necessary conditions of middle class life, i.e. a flat in the city. So together, the Tamaki, as a leader in the community more broadly, made a relatively quick start. Tamaki himself introduces the idea of cooperative housing in a paper that he gives at a conference in 1913 in September. As of January, the Kanara Saraswat community is already coming together in a community meeting to get the project started. And by the December of the following year, so 1915, again, the first 3 buildings are open. They're available and people are moving in. There are 18 flats originally. Tamaki moves into 1. And again, meant to be modern, meant to be comfortable, meant to be private, meant to be supportive of middle-class life. The success and it was seen as sort of rapid, massive success of the society immediately inspires others, particularly within the Kanara Saraswat community. So in 1917, the Gamdevi Society adds another 3 buildings, again, expanding access to others in the community. In 1919, there's a second cooperative housing society for Kanara Saraswat that opens in Santa Cruz. This is a much bigger one in scale. So here there's 10 blocks offering 80 flats altogether, along with some privately owned cottages. And these are everything from 2 to 3, and in some cases 4-room flats in this project. More ambitious projects follow in the 1930s. What's known as Ananda Ashram Society opens in 1937. And then the Tamaki Wadi Society opens on Tardeo Road in 1940. This is meant very specifically for the lower middle classes, so mostly 1-bedroom flats, so 1 bedroom with a hall and a kitchen, a few 2-room flats more broadly. By sort of more activism after World War II, by 1956, fully 36% of the entire community in Bombay is living in cooperative housing. So the community takes this initial idea and runs with it really successfully. Central to cooperative housing, like with the Parsi Bogs, is the sense that these are not only residential spaces. It's not just you get a flat, you also get access to and are included in a whole range of other things that are going on. At the Gamdevi Society, among those first 3 buildings, 2 flats are reserved for the bank on the one hand, and the Kanara Saraswat Association offices and a meeting hall on the other. And in the early 1920s, there's all kinds of events going on in that meeting hall in Gamdevi. Things like lectures, classes for women, singing of kirtans, celebration of student success in competitions, examinations or sports, baby shows, drama performances, badminton tournaments, concerts, all kinds of stuff. To give those events more space and more access to room, when Tamaki Society comes up, one of the buildings is specifically designed in order to accommodate a community hall on the first floor. So this first floor right here is the community hall, which is built. They have to do all sorts of new, interesting structural engineering. This is why it shows up in the Indian Concrete Journal. In order to make this possible, and again, can expand the scale of the wedding festivities or the different lectures that they're able to hold there. But again, these sort of community events weren't confined to the Gamdevi or Tamaki Wadi societies. At the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society out in Santa Cruz, they had a sort of report on activities in 1927 that had the most fabulous list of activities. Some of them were the basic ones. There was weekly religious classes, lectures on social hygiene, magic lantern shows, but there's also a demonstration of ventriloquism, a clarinet performance, daily activities at the recently opened gymnasium with lots of bodybuilding going on, and then a ladies' music class that had 26 women enrolled. So again, the idea being that you don't just move into a flat and then shut the door. You are immediately enveloped in and incorporated in a whole range of activities that are accessible to you and to which you are encouraged to attend. Okay, so those are my two examples, the Parsi example on the one hand and the Saraswat example on the other. I want to bring out some of the commonalities between them because there's all kinds of obvious differences. The most basic being the Parsi one operates on a philanthropic model. Money is donated, money is provided by a trust, houses are built, and then flats are offered at reduced and very concessional rents over time. Again, one of the rents in the Mers Banchals was 8 paise for widows, and this was in 1915. So again, this was really concessional rents. But there's also real commonalities across these, and I want to sort of think about these in a couple categories. One, and I think one of the more fundamental ones, is the ways in which both types of projects are creating a certain kind of middle-class expectation for what housing should mean. So this is a floor plan, for all of you architecture students, of the first buildings at the Gum Devi Society. And the crucial part is that if any of you have read Nicol Rao's great work on the history of Mumbai, there's the enclosed toilet and washroom facilities within each flat. They're meant to give private facilities, allow private domesticities, bedrooms separated from the hall, individual toilets that are still accessible to sweepers who come in from outside, offered within each space. The idea being that our people, in this sense, either the Saraswats or the Parsis, find it impossible to make do in a one-room chawl. One-room chawls are insupportable with the dignity and the respectability of the middle class. We need more space. So when Talmaki, who is, again, talking about what he defines as the lower middle class, in his mind, it is impossible that anyone would be able to live in less than 2 to 5 rooms. So he's writing this in 1915 when almost everybody lived in Bombay in one room except the very wealthy. Monterji Joshi, similarly, when he starts the Dadar Parsi colony, he does it so that he can rescue people from single room units and move them into self-contained flats. This is part of the project. A second element of commonality is the emphasis on and the sort of obsession with sanitation and the sort of presence of toilets with flushing toilets within the flat is part of this. One of the major impulses behind housing reform in Bombay, as I'd mentioned before, was this fear of ill health. The fear that if you don't keep houses clean, if the city does not have good housing conditions across all units, we're all going to die. And the plague had been a convincing example of that. People died in the tens and of thousands by the month for that. So the community housing projects come up in that element of fear about sanitation, sanitary principles, rescuing people from ill health. And they promise to extract their residents from slums, overcrowded conditions, bad buildings, and put them into better ones. The crucial part, though, is that they have to ensure that the conditions are better. And they do that in a couple of ways. One is by how they arrange space both within and outside of buildings. So there's a big emphasis on siting in order to ensure proper open spaces, adequate ventilation, things like that. There's a 1909 article that comes out called Unhygienic Bombay, which is surveying all the ways in which housing is going to kill us all in the city. And that article singled out Mers Banchals, quote, for the correct and even distribution of the occupants to buildings and rooms, and the erection of the buildings on proper sanitary principles. So again, we build these buildings right, things will immediately get better. Sorry. The problem, of course, is that you couldn't entirely depend on the buildings. People do all kinds of things inside their buildings, which then can contribute to ill health. So all of these projects also start to discipline their residents into certain kinds of behaviors, which I cannot show you on my next slide. Anuj. Sorry. So weird that it goes on and off that way. Okay, yeah, perfect. So these are the rules for the guidance of the society's tenants at the Saraswat Cooperative Housing Society. And one of the things that they dictate is how you dispose of garbage, how you need to keep your unit clean, all these other things, etc. So I'll just show you the close-up of that area that I had there. So Rule 6, all residents in the society's buildings are required to cooperate in keeping the dwellings clean and healthy. No sweepings, water, kitchen refuse, or the like shall be thrown out the windows of the veranda. veranda. All rubbish shall be collected into a bin. You have to clean your WC. If it's choked, we're going to fine you for it. All residents in the society's dwellings are required to behave in such a way as to cause no annoyance. So again, written into the foundation of the society is rules for good behavior. And if you don't follow them, we will kick you out. So that sense of disciplining sanitation, disciplining hygiene, convincing that this is in fact a new kind of living space, was not just the structures of the building, but the instructions for how to occupy those buildings. And again, these were relatively common. Kasrabag had its own rules on hygiene and sanitation and protection for ventilation, things like that. The third area of commonality is, again, the sort of common focus on community building, the ways in which these are projects that built in a focus on membership in community activities that are restricted to the people who you are like in one way or the other. So it's not just that these are places that reserve spaces for community activities. They all have playgrounds, they all have gardens, they all have halls for marriages. They all have, again, some have religious structures. They often have a library, often have a gymnasium by the 1940s. But they also set out, and this is more of the community effort of the residents there, they set out to organize an incredible array of community events. So there's welfare leagues for the poorer members of the community. There's children's play groups. There's women's groups to organize lectures and religious ceremonies, et cetera. There's sports clubs. Again, the sense in which communities are forming new associations within the colony to organize events within the colony and to engage the residents of the colony. And again, these were things that were available not just to the people within the walls, but to anyone who lived nearby. So you didn't have to live in Kasrabag to go to the Abigain there. You didn't have to live at Gamdevi to come to the KSA hall there and to participate in activities. But what they're doing is they're essentially foregrounding, making primary, making obvious the ways in which when you come together by community. You join a Parsi Gymkhana. You join the Kanara Saraswat Association. You join a library that is restricted to your community. And this, is obviously exclusionary, but it was intended, and the sort of emphasis at the time was on it as a way to build fellow feeling, to build community connections, to make it a true community center, not just a residential structure. And again, it seems to have been experienced as such. So in the Diamond Jubilee sort of commemorative volume for Kasrabag, one of the residents argued that the colony was, quote, not just a shelter, sorry, I can barely see, or haven, but an experience in community living and togetherness to enhance Parsi luster on Indian soil. So again, what that quote suggests is it was experienced as a collective, and a collective which was not just a passive thing, but then advanced the community, made it more prominent, advanced its sporting achievement, intellectual achievements, etc. So that then brings us to the final commonality that I'd like to think of is the ways in which these housing efforts were seen as marking off Parsis on the one hand and Kanara Saraswats on the other as distinctive. And again, you can see this from the very early articles from the Parsis. It's always the early Mirs Banchals are said as showing that we Parsis care more about our poor than anyone else. And that language of the sort of unusual philanthropy, the unusual care for the poor, continues to the foundation of all the bogs in the 20s and the 30s, et cetera. For Kanara Saraswats, the language is more of being particularly progressive, particularly modern, particularly willing to embrace new institutions and new institutional forms. And so these are important. They transform the image of the community by reputation. Parsis are known as having this history of housing, but then they also transform the reputation of the community by material fact. If you got one of those first flats in the Gamdevi Society, you were established as middle class for all time. That becomes a secure occupation, a secure home, a secure base in the city that then can allow you to prosper and thrive. And again, these become marked off as distinctive in terms of the overall extent of the community housed. So in the Parsi case, the estimates are that half of all Parsis lived in Parsi colonies or bogs by the 1950s. In the Saraswat case, they got to 50% in cooperative housing by about 1971. Okay, I'm going to wrap up, I promise. That last sort of point about the idea that 20th century projects end up transforming the long-term residential experiences of communities is the sort of transition I want to make into thinking about the so what. Why did these matter? Again, not just for individuals but for the communities and then more broadly for Bombay as a city. My argument would be that they matter in ways that define community and that help refine community in the city. So these are projects that are not just enabled by community. They're not just made possible by community. They help to then define community experiences, what it means to be a member of these groups within the city. And specifically, I'll think about that in three main ways. One is that, again, togetherness, that sense that there is a unity, a coherence, intensity, a fellow feeling that is created through these different communities. I was just visiting with the granddaughter of the founder of the Dadar Parsi colony yesterday, and she used this language that you see in all these commemorative issues from these projects that says, we're like one big family. When there's a wedding, the entire colony is here. When something happens, we all participate. We're all connected. We're all part of this together. And this is something you see, and again, the sort of memorials about the Gamdevi Society, when you go to Talmakiwadi, etc. People saying, we've been in and out of each other's flats for 100 years, for 50 years. We grew up together. Our grandmothers knew each other. We've done all our things together. We went to school together. We joined clubs together. We played sports together. We got married and came to each other's weddings. People aren't moving out of that, partly because you have a great spot in the city, but also because there's such a tight-knit sense of community there that you can, again, define in close proximity. Which obviously doesn't mean that without housing projects, there is no community, or that this is the only way to have that community. There's all kinds of, great example of community neighbors in other places, or community associations that don't have a housing basis. But these make those connections more strong, more intense, more real on an everyday, deeply interconnected way. The second effect is that thing I mentioned about the middle class. So when not just the elite in your community can move out of a one-room chawl, but people who are defined as lower middle class in the Saraswat example, or as poor, and sometimes quite poor in the Parsi example. When even the poor and middle class move into self-contained flats with their own toilets, with private amenities, separate bedrooms, this establishes, again, a sort of reputation of the community as itself middle class. And as we know, reputations can do all kinds of things for you in a city. It can help you get a job. It can help you secure loans. It can help you access different kinds of things. So we know that everyone who lived in these communities was not themselves middle class by income. So even today at the Dadar Parsi colony, there's welfare associations that give out free food to the poor members of the community. But you're living in a middle class space with middle class expectations for privacy, domesticity, respectability, etc. And that shapes the image of the community overall. The third effect, and this is something that the architectural historian Preeti Chopra has written about, is that these projects give geographic stability and fixity to communities in the city. So Bombay, as we know, is a city that changes, right? People move from here to there. You no longer work near Churchgate, and so you move out to wherever your job is, or you move out to Borivali, and so after a long time, it's too hard to commute to the city, and you find a job out here. So there's a strong sense in which communities have changed where they live in the city over time. This used to be a center for this neighborhood, and now it's not. And again, Parsis are a great example. In the Fort area, there's 5 separate agyaris, and they are almost all empty all the time, dusty, used occasionally, but that is no longer where the community lives. What the bogs and colonies and cooperative housing societies do, though, is they fix communities in place. There will always be Saraswats at the Gamdevi Society because only Saraswats can live at the Gamdevi Society. There will always be Parsis at Khusro Bagh or Rustam Bagh or Jur Bagh because only Parsis can live in those colonies. And again, the examples of agyaris is a great way to see this. So agyaris have been moving around the city following populations for a long time. Once they move into a bog, they stop. So the Karani Agyari in Khusro Bagh was originally in Null Bazaar, moves to Khusro Bagh to follow the community in because there was nobody left in Null Bazaar. Similarly, the one out in Malcolm Bagh was originally in the Fort area, moves out in the 1960s to follow the community. So again, you can fix your community in space, you can give it a certain kind of coherence, and then since it's fixed in space, it has a different kind of legibility, a different kind of visibility. The community is part of the fabric of the city in a very obvious way, written on the very walls outside. So again, the Parsi bogs declare that they are Parsi bogs on the outside. Okay, what does this do to the city then? What's the effects on the city? That sense of geographic stability then thinks about the ways in which these projects by small communities affecting relatively small numbers of people affect the city overall. They do so only partially in institutional form. So nobody else has the money or decides to use the money in the same way as the Parsis. There's no similar example of trying to house half the community in planned community charitable housing. So the cooperative example does take off. It takes off by the 30s. There's already a whole variety of cooperative housing societies across the city. By the 1950s, those number explodes. Once the builders take them over, then the numbers go up still more. So the institutional structure of cooperative housing societies certainly lives on. But I would argue that the sort of more important emphasis or the more important legacy of these projects is the ways in which they tie community and housing together. So they create this model which is celebrated, encouraged, given special concessions of creating housing for one community. Legally, constitutionally, by covenant, they restrict others out. And that obviously at the time was seen as this incredibly progressive thing. We Saraswats like each other very much. It is easier to mobilize capital from within our community. We should form this association. But the recent stories of Muslims being unable to get a flat in a certain building because they're Muslim reveal the sort of darker side of this, right? It's also a deeply exclusionary move. And so that sense in which the emphasis on community housing, whether in cooperative form, whether in BOG form, or very quickly in commercial form, starts to take over the city. So that even by 1990, the Bombay Improvement Trust is considering and actively encouraging requests by different communities for blocks of houses together. They prefer to get them that way. They will take individual plots and lease them out for sure. But when they get a group of requests from Kutchis, in a couple cases, a couple Telugu groups come to them, those are the ones they encourage, and they want to foster them and support them. So again, if we think about the legacy of these societies, at the time, and to people who live in them, they were very much exercises in self-help, in ground level community building, in deepening community relationships, and encouraging the sense of commonality. But they may very well and probably should have been experienced by outsiders at the time as a sort of ultimate expression of privilege for what were, in both cases, very elite communities, Brahmins and Parsi groups in this sense. So that by securing a home for us, which is what community housing promises, I'm very much saying that I want to not give a home for you. And so that dual role of the exclusion and inclusion, I think, is the part that we should all end with. Okay, thank you, and I would love to get questions and comments.
Hi. Would you have any idea about the Parsi chawls that are there at Mendi Bazaar near Cooper Lane and in Nagdevi Street at Crawford Market? What happened at that time? Why did they
there's lots of Parsi chawls that were started before in a more informal manner, and I have seen lots of records for them or mention of them in the newspapers. I don't know as much about their history because they don't show up in a public institutional sense. Yeah. What makes Merzban chawls unique is that he founds a organization, the GZRF, I'm going to get the acronym wrong, which has to register with the government, and it has to give annual reports, and it has to report on its activities. So it's a very much more public project. There's all these tantalizing things of being like, oh, Oblesbog was this, and this was here. These ones I don't know. It also, though, has been partly how I've been doing this research. So I got interested in the Parsi chawls when I was, unfortunately, in Vermont, which is not a great place to research them, to be honest. So I could get access to a lot of online, the Times of India online has online records, etc. But some of the more detailed, nuanced, street-level stuff is exactly why I'm here. So I'd love your thoughts. Yes.
Hi. It's interesting that you chose these two communities, the Parsis and the Saraswats, and I'm wondering if the need to sort of build cooperative housing societies was because these two communities particularly are both diasporic within India. So sort of they don't have like a native place to call their own. And this model sort of gives them a territory which they can mark as belonging to that particular caste or group within Bombay.
I think you're totally right. So there's a sense in which, there's a lot of Kannada Saraswats who are still going back to Kannada. So there's that sense of sort of going back. But there's also a sense in which their economic fortune, their their professional futures were deeply rooted in Bombay. And yeah, there is no home base here. There is no starting point. So it's a community that emerges out of Chawls. The first sort of example of the Kanara Saraswat Association is an informal club that met in the students' rooms in a chawl near Gamdevi. So that sense in which it comes out of a sense of how do we build roots in a city. But what I've always been interested in is the ways in which those roots have stayed long after many other things have. And so the sense in which it was a remarkably successful example of building those roots, in which, you know, different groups have come to the city and lived in different parts of the city, and you will still find deep clusters. But that sense of rendering that legible and rendering it also publicly visible becomes central to both of these projects.
You talked about the fellow feeling in the community or in the residents, but especially I'm talking about the Saraswat colonies. It's also very much based on the caste.
Yeah.
And though it was a fellow feeling, it was more amongst the caste, and it kind of nurtured a casteist atmosphere in that area. All these public amenities which were not open for outside caste, you know, and Saraswats being very high caste, and of course higher middle class and higher caste as well, they became very exclusive spaces. So how would you, whether you would critique that, because it's not just simple community. I mean, there was a hierarchy, like, you know, so.
So that sense of where the sort of hierarchy and exclusivity comes in, again, there's this real tension that actually Talmaki from the beginning does not want to form a caste-specific cooperative housing society. The Bombay Cooperative Housing Association sets out to try to create pan-caste, pan-community, open community housing societies. They simply can't get them going. So the sort of Kanara Saraswat one comes up because everybody else has fallen off the game to some extent. And there's a real tension at the moment. There's a real awareness of the ways in which the more you promote caste-specific or Parsi-specific, community-specific organizations, the more you're then denying the very kind of common, more national feelings that are growing in Bombay by the minute. So there's this real sort of tension in a lot of the writings even from within the community of saying, you know what, caste-specific associations are not okay. They can only make us feel less commonality with people who are not in our community. And we need to be reducing this kind of exclusivity and building towards something else. So there was that awareness and that feeling, even while, as you say, the sort of drum roll and the level of amenities and special materials offered for within that very narrow, very exclusive group are continuing. So those were absolutely tensions from the beginning. And again, something that they wrestled with much more then. I think now they don't. I should make another point that when I stress the community feeling, that was not always a good thing also. So when people talk about them as one big family, whoa, there were fights too. There's this great letter I was just reading between the head of the Navrozbagh Children's Center and the head of the Navrozbagh Welfare League, who apparently hated each other. And they were fighting over who should best control the resources in Navrozbagh. So this, you know, even the sense in which community was sometimes they were at each other's throats because it was a, you know, controlled set of resources. Yes.
I think the idea of the cooperative housing society as a housing delivery model somehow saw its demise with the birth of the developer, right? And somewhere around the 90s, maybe late 80s, 90s. I'm just thinking, and of course also there was also the problem of the exclusionary nature of the cooperative housing societies. I'm wondering if you know of examples in India or any other parts of the world where the cooperative housing society also worked, and if there were other models of communities that kind of evolved, you know, which were perhaps not as exclusionary.
Well, it's actually one of the really interesting stories that the cooperative housing in India emerges off of the British model. There's also a German model, but they tend to follow the British model more. And the British model had been very much, I mean, partly because the differences were more of the sort of class differences, but they would definitely be people who came together around work, who came together as we commonly are people who work in this field, or we work for this employer, and so we will start housing. I had a paper I was doing recently on, again, the history of shopping in the city. The Army and Navy store starts out of it's a cooperative store. It's meant for members of the Army and Navy services to come together and buy stuff at a cheaper rate. It's not the image of what we think of it as this exclusive department store here in Mumbai. But that sense in which cooperatives emerge in Britain on a class-based model, and so it would be interesting to know whether they exclude Catholics, for instance. That would probably be the most relevant example there. There are examples in India of where you can see people trying to push the edges of it. So one of the first cooperative housing societies after Gamdevi is actually one set up by the railways for their employees. But it's done in the way that sort of officers' flats are done, which is our officers, because they need better housing, we're going to fund the cooperative housing society. So it's not really a good example. One of my favorite examples is actually from Ahmedabad, where there's the Panchsheel Cooperative Housing Society set up at the sort of big moment of, the agreement with China as a way to solidify a certain kind of nationalist outlook. That's a rarity, though, in Ahmedabad. Most of those are community-based there, too. Yeah.
Actually, for some time now, I've been contemplating on the notion of secularism in a way, where, let's say, in these community housing, in a way, cooperative housing society or the Parsi housing society kind of speak of a certain idea of a camp for a certain group of people belonging either to associated by the religion or by their caste. So, but the current discourse on secularism kind of talks about blending, amalgamation. The problem that you mentioned about Muslims not getting flats easily in the building, for instance. Is there something that these models teaches about the notion of a different form of secularism? In the sense, I mean, if you consider secularism within the building, it certainly appears alienating. But if you consider the city as a whole, then the different nature of secularism emerges. Although, of course, they appear very exclusionary, the Parsi colony is not accessible by all. But I think the public realm, in that sense, is open for all, right? I mean, it kind of puts forward a different idea of secularism in that sense. If you can maybe elaborate something on that. And is there something to learn for contemporary times?
As a historian, I try to avoid talking about contemporary times whenever possible, but let me say, one of the things that I would say to that is that there's a way in which one of the things that's interesting about both the Parsi and the Saraswat example is that both are seen at their time as not religious institutions, but as caste or community institutions. So there's all these debates in the early 20th century about who's a Parsi, who's not a Parsi. What's who has to practice? Is it by ritual? Is it by this? Is it by that? And so I posed that question to the granddaughter of Mansherji Joshi, and she's like, "No, if your dad's a Parsi, you could be in the community. It's fine. That's how it worked for housing." And so that sense, and the Kanara Saraswat example is similar. That the qualifications for membership were not you followed a particular religious leader, because there was all kinds of disputes with the then religious leader of the community. It was, are you a member of the community of the founder of the bank, of Shamravedal? So again, it's attempting to take religion out of the definition of community in ways that you can't, obviously, but that all of the activities they were doing, the religious part was always a very small part and very much subsumed in the larger context of schooling and gymkhanas and libraries and reading rooms. So it was a sort of secular definition of caste exclusionary. And I think there's a real tension there, obviously. It's an impossible balance to hold. But when you think about some of the real religious debates underway in both communities at that time, it was also at that moment kind of a progressive image, that the group in charge of the Gamdevi Society is a society of people who agree to come together and have a society. There's no religious leader. It doesn't have anything to do with religious beliefs. It's just, we are this thing. Exclusionary, hierarchical, and exclusive, to be sure. But in a version, they saw it as a move towards secularism. So, great question. Thank you.
After the riots that happened in Mumbai, even the Muslims and the Hindus formed different communities and they gathered together. So even though the stimulus was different, like in this, it was a different thing, but there a different thing happened. Do you think this was progressive, like forming different communities as Muslims and Hindus?
That's a great question. Is it progressive? Were they progressive? I think the answer varies according to when and how you see it. I think at the time, I think they were seen as very progressive. If you started something now, would it feel progressive? No. So I think that sense of, one, the transient nature of the community, two, this debate over how do you be more secular in a sense in which the community wants to define itself by religious lines. I think for their moments, they were actually trying to be very progressive. I think the legacy stops being progressive at some point. When that is, I don't know. But certainly the sense in which there's a really, the picture changes dramatically over time. One of the things I loved when I did a bunch of research in Ahmedabad, originally thinking this was going to be an Ahmedabad-Mumbai project, and that was totally unmanageable. And I went around interviewing all these old guys who had been part of early housing cooperatives, and they all talked about, we were struggling middle class, and we had to walk miles to get to the school, and it was so hard, and we were barely making it. And now they're sitting on these properties in the heart of the city that they've made crores from, right? They're massively wealthy. And so the thing that was like, thank God we middle class can get together and barely scrape it together, like, that was a good choice, So the even the economics of it looks so different over time, even before the builders get involved. The sense in which, as the city expands and these societies emerge, end up being in the very heart of things, which had been a sort of brave attempt to move to the periphery, becomes really great financial planning for the people lucky enough to get the flat.
I mean, just to kind of extend that question on secular societies, I think the architecturally, I'm just pointing some more details about what happens when the apartment kind of lands in the city of Mumbai, and the apartment has a specific typological difference from the chawl earlier.
Yep.
And in many ways, it kind of for communities, it was very, very specific because its relationship with the street was disrupted in a very different way. I mean, it was changed, not disrupted. For example, there were no shops on the apartment ground floor. There's like Parsi colonies in most cases were also gated very clearly.
Right.
And also the kind of in the house detail itself, and just one more point, matter of detail. I mean, the plan was very interesting because, I mean, very clearly the two doors to the same apartment, and one door opening straight into the toilet, and I think that one door of the opening straight into the toilet and the other door into the living room and the kitchen, the main door. It took some time for the apartment to kind of come to terms with the city and the culture as well as the opposite. It took some time for the society to come to terms with the apartment, and I feel in that the cosmopolitanism of the city kind of gets renegotiated, in terms of not only the ethnic groups but also in terms of class. It starts renegotiated. So I think that is just a suggestive point to the research. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. And Nikhil Rao's work on the sort of rise of the flat in Bombay is just lovely. I love his work on every level. And I think that, that sense in which it's a negotiation over time that changes has been really powerful. But I think one of the things that's been so interesting is thinking about the ways in which Charles and, the sort of where the sharp division is and where the sort of slippage is. So from Neera's book on Charles and, other writing, that sense in which Charles were experiences deeply communal spaces, right? Who lived where, who lived on which floors, who was permitted to sort of use the facilities. That sense in which, sort of exclusionary practices around housing are built into how most cities in the world live. This is hardly particular to Bombay. And so the fact that this is one negotiation of it in which a gate on the outside moves that negotiation further away from the inner resources of the street, of the house. So you're right, the sort of renegotiation of what the sort of outside inside, the sort of street to domestic space, the sort of playground space or the sort of communal space around a chawl versus the communal space around these. All of those things are being renegotiated in this.
Hi. So there's been a lot of talk of how a lot of these societies are exclusionary, and from the pictures and what Sir just mentioned, a lot of them are in a way fortress-like.
Yeah.
And I think if the hypothesis could be that going with the fact that they are exclusionary, I'm just wondering where the research would lead as to how as to how we could address the issues of nationalism or communalism in today's times, and as to how the today also, if you look at the districts in the city, you can make out very clearly in which parts what kind of communities live. So I'm just wondering how this research could kind of address the issue in today's times.
Thank you. Somebody else would have to do that project, and if you want to sign up, I'd love it. But so one of the things that I think is helpful to think about for me in this is thinking about the ways in which there's a sort of negotiation of space over time, and the ways in which boundaries are created and enforced and negotiated alter in different moments. So in the sort of pre-Bombay Improvement Trust era, neighborhoods could be very private spaces because there'd be very limited public thoroughfares. Once you got into the interior lanes, it would feel much more like the inside of your house. So that sense in which old neighborhoods in the sort of, Kamatipur or other areas of the town could feel much, much more deeply communal and much more deeply community focused than was possible in some of the newer areas of the town. When you build when you do the reclamation areas in the Back Bay, that possibility isn't there. There's thoroughfares that's going through everywhere. And so the redesign of the space around the Bombay Improvements Trust emphasis and obsession with, mobility of transport, then actually makes it impossible to have the earlier kinds of community spaces. So there's a spatial shift that I think allows you to think about where some of these same things came up with. But then there's also the sort of more recent example of, Thomas Hanson's work, the ways in which politics start to enforce boundaries in much more obvious ways, in much more brutal ways, starting from the 70s. And so the sense in which there's different techniques for community definition, community boundary making, and community policing, that these represent a moment in which physical walls seem like one solution because the new city landscape didn't provide it. Once it becomes possible for, a group of people who didn't want you there to smash down the gate, those walls don't do you any good. So the ways in which I think there would, the much longer history, which please write would be great, would be thinking about, again, how those exclusionary practices change, responding to the changing political landscape and the changing economics of the city. This is why I love giving public talks. I had totally never thought of that before, but you are absolutely right. Yes, and the ways in which, again, these are coming up on new lands, and they're enabled by new street patterns, and they respond to those street patterns with different kinds of possibilities. So, yes, I'm going to write that down.
I just have one question. Do you see anybody leaving these societies? I mean, is it empty, or are the populations reducing in them?
So the leaving question is a good one. I don't, the Gamdevi Society and the Tamakiwadi ones are the ones I know best from the Saraswat example, and I've got sort of scattered examples from the other parts in colony and elsewhere. So the Gamdevi Society, their problem is that everybody's dying. For the children, they've had to move out and get their own flats in the suburbs, and now they look back at these, and for them, they're really small. They're really crowded. They're not actually a great layout. For having multiple children and wanting to have the space that you might have in a flat in the suburbs. So a lot of the flats are still owned by the original tenants or the children of the original tenants, but now their children don't want to come back and move into them as the parents get old, and so it becomes this like, what are we going to do kind of problem. There was a big debate right before the 100th anniversary of the Gamdevi Society about whether or not they should tear it down and allow a big high-rise to be built. And there was a strong, we were the first society in Asia, no way, these are historic buildings. So they didn't do it. But that tension is there, that these are spaces that no longer exactly match the either economic abilities or the aspirations of the community. I know in the Parsi colonies, Dadar Parsi colony, for instance, there's wait lists of 6,000 years to get into any of the flats there. I know, and I haven't done any research on this, but I know in Khusrowbagh, for instance, they now, when a flat turns over, some of them are offered at much more market rents. So some are offered at entirely concessional rents of 250 rupees or something, and then some you pay through the nose through. So I think that's how they've done it. There's a great anthropologist who's working on the sort of Parsi housing in the contemporary setting. Her name is Laila Vaivani, and she's got some great stuff that's coming out about how those reuses have been renegotiated under the authority of the Bombay Parsi Bandai.
I just have one more question. The Saraswat CHS, is it under the heritage laws? Does it come under that?
I think so. I can't remember. I think it is, yes, but don't quote me on that. I know they were trying to and have been very involved in heritage efforts in the city. I think it is. You see, once you ask me anything beyond the past, I'm like, I don't know.
Thank you so much. I think it was a brilliant kind of talk, and you can see that there was so much interest around this, and especially I think the city is really cooking up to the question of home, housing, and you must be aware of the kind of whole momentum towards the state of housing exhibition. So I think there's a lot of interest around home. We have also kind of finished a lot of projects on the home. So it was a really nice kind of initiation of this cycle of, and especially the way in which kind of, how community housing itself becomes antithetical in some way to consider today. So, and also the nuances that get worked out between these two things. So I think it is a really thought-provoking kind of exercise. Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you all for joining us. For those who kind of are having friends who are going to soon enroll for architecture, we have an open house tomorrow at school arranged for newcomers, where we'll kind of answer fresh questions and urgent things about admissions at our school. So please kind of recommend to come them to come here, and we'll have our next talk in another fortnight, and we'll update our portals soon. Thank you so much for being connected, and please come again. Thank you.